The dust cloud rose behind Grace Sullivan like a funeral shroud as she trudged along the dirt road leading away from Humboldt, Nevada. Each step a small rebellion against the life she had just escaped. The September sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly on her bonnet, and the single carpetbag she carried felt heavier with each passing mile. But she refused to look back at the town where her uncle had tried to sell her off to a saloon owner twice her age. At 23, she had seen enough of men who thought women were property to be bartered, and she would rather die in the desert than submit to that fate. The sound of hoofbeats made her heart leap into her throat. She turned, shading her eyes against the glare, and saw a lone rider approaching at an easy canter. Her hand instinctively moved to the small knife she kept hidden in her skirt pocket, though she knew it would do little good if this stranger meant her harm. Out here, miles from anywhere, she was entirely at the mercy of whoever was coming her way. The rider slowed as he approached, and Grace could make out more details. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. His horse was a beautiful paint, well-kept and obviously cared for. As he drew closer, he pulled his hat off respectfully, revealing a face that looked to be in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin, dark brown hair, and eyes the color of creek water in summer. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying a natural warmth that seemed at odds with the harsh landscape. "Name's Preston Lewis. I don't mean to intrude, but it's a long walk to anywhere from here, and the desert isn't kind to folks on foot. Can I offer you a ride?" Grace studied him carefully, weighing her limited options. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, but there was something gentle in his expression, a softness around his eyes that suggested kindness rather than cruelty. Still, she had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Lewis, but I'm managing just fine," she said, hearing the lie even as it left her lips. Her feet were already blistered, and she had only been walking for a few hours. She had at least 20 miles to go before she reached the next town. Preston shifted in his saddle, glancing at the sun's position. "With respect, madam, you won't make it to Winnemucca before nightfall, and the temperature drops something fierce once the sun goes down. I've got a homestead about 10 miles northeast, and my mother would never forgive me if I left a lady stranded out here. I can take you there, get you a hot meal and a safe place to rest, and tomorrow I'll take you wherever you're headed. I give you my word as a gentleman that no harm will come to you." Something in his tone made Grace believe him. Perhaps it was the mention of his mother, or the genuine concern in his eyes, or simply the fact that her feet hurt so badly she could barely think straight. She nodded slowly. "My name is Grace Sullivan, and I'd be grateful for the help." Preston dismounted in one fluid motion and approached her carefully, as though she were a skittish horse he didn't want to spook. Up close, she could see the laugh lines around his eyes and the honest, open expression on his face. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of hard work and long days under the sun. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Sullivan," he said, taking her carpetbag and securing it behind his saddle. "I'm going to help you up now, if that's all right." Grace nodded, and before she could prepare herself, his hands were around her waist, lifting her onto the horse with surprising gentleness. He swung up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance even as his arms came around her to hold the reins. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, solid and reassuring. "Hold on," he said softly, and they started moving at a gentle walk that gradually increased to a steady trot. As they rode, Preston kept up a stream of easy conversation that seemed designed to put her at ease. He told her about his homestead, a small ranch he had built up over the past 5 years after his father died. He raised horses, mostly, breeding them for endurance and intelligence rather than just speed. His mother, Margaret, lived with him, managing the household and maintaining a garden that was the envy of everyone within 50 miles. "How did you end up walking alone on that road?" Preston asked after a while, his tone careful. "If you don't mind my asking." "It's unusual to see anyone on foot out here, let alone a lady traveling alone." Grace hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something about Preston's presence made her feel safe enough to share at least part of the truth. "I was staying with my uncle in Humboldt. He's my only living relative, or so I thought when I came west from Missouri 6 months ago. Turns out he was more interested in what he could get for me than in providing a home. I left before he could make good on his plans." She felt Preston tense behind her. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Grace said quickly. "I left before it came to that. I heard him talking to a man named Callahan who owns the biggest saloon in town. They were discussing terms and I knew I had to get out." "Callahan," Preston said, and there was steel in his voice. "I know of him." "You did right to leave, Miss Sullivan. A man like that would have made your life hell." They rode in silence for a while after that, and Grace found herself relaxing against Preston's solid presence. The rhythmic movement of the horse and the warmth of the afternoon sun made her drowsy, and she had to fight to keep her eyes open. She hadn't slept well in weeks, not since she had first overheard her uncle's plans. "It's all right," Preston murmured. "You can rest if you need to." "I won't let you fall." Grace wanted to protest, to maintain the vigilance that had kept her alive this long, but exhaustion won out. She let her eyes close just for a moment and felt herself drifting. When she woke, the sun was lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. They were riding through a valley dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood tree. In the distance, she could see a cluster of buildings that looked well-maintained and prosperous. "Welcome to the Lewis Ranch," Preston said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's home." As they drew closer, Grace could see that Preston's modesty was unwarranted. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. There were several outbuildings, including a large barn, a stable, and what looked like a bunkhouse. A fence enclosed a substantial corral where several horses grazed peacefully. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her early 50s, Grace guessed, with gray streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and the same kind eyes as her son. "Preston," she called. "I wasn't expecting you back until tomorrow. And who's this?" Preston dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands steady on her waist. "Mama, this is Miss Grace Sullivan. I found her walking on the Humboldt Road. Miss Sullivan, this is my mother, Margaret Lewis." Margaret's expression shifted immediately from curiosity to concern. She hurried forward, taking Grace's hands in her own work-roughened ones. "You poor dear. Walking in this heat. Come inside right now. You must be exhausted and parched." Before Grace could protest, Margaret had swept her up the porch steps and into the house. The interior was cooler, with whitewashed walls and simple but comfortable furniture. Everything was spotlessly clean, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. "Sit, sit," Margaret insisted, guiding Grace to a chair at a large wooden table. She poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and pressed it into Grace's hands. "Drink slowly, dear." "Preston, put some more wood in the stove. I'll make us a proper meal." Preston obeyed his mother with the ease of long practice, and Grace watched the easy interaction between them with something like envy. Her own parents had died when she was 15, victims of a cholera outbreak that had swept through their town. She had lived with various relatives after that, never quite finding a place where she belonged. Over dinner, which consisted of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from Margaret's garden, Grace found herself telling them more about her situation. Margaret's face grew stormier with each detail, and by the time Grace finished, the older woman was practically vibrating with righteous anger. "That despicable man," Margaret said, "to treat his own niece that way. You poor child. Well, you're safe here, Grace. May I call you Grace?" "Please do, Mrs. Lewis. And you'll call me Margaret. Now, I won't hear any arguments. You'll stay here tonight, get a proper rest, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. We have a spare room upstairs that hasn't been used since my sister visited last spring." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "I can't impose on you like that." "It's not an imposition," Preston said quietly. He had been mostly silent during dinner, but his eyes had rarely left her face. "It's what decent people do. You need help, and we can provide it. It's as simple as that." Later that night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets for the first time in months, Grace stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day's events. She had expected to spend the night huddled by the roadside, praying that no predators, human or otherwise, found her. Instead, she was safe and warm, taken in by strangers who asked for nothing in return. She thought about Preston, about the gentle strength in his hands when he helped her onto the horse, the protective anger in his voice when she told him about her uncle. He was unlike any man she had ever met, and that terrified her almost as much as it intrigued her. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. She dressed quickly in the same travel-stained dress she had worn yesterday, acutely aware of how shabby she must look. When she came downstairs, she found Margaret already in the kitchen, working on breakfast. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said cheerfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Grace admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "Nonsense. Now I've been thinking. Preston mentioned you were headed to Winnemucca. Do you have people there?" Grace shook her head. "Not exactly. I was hoping to find work, maybe as a seamstress or a schoolteacher. I have some education and I'm good with a needle." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Those are valuable skills. But Winnemucca can be rough, especially for a young woman on her own. Have you considered staying in this area? We could use someone with your abilities." Before Grace could respond, Preston entered through the back door, his shirt already dusty from morning chores. His face lit up when he saw her, and Grace felt her heart do an unexpected flutter. "Morning, Miss Sullivan," he said. "I hope you're feeling rested." "I am, thank you, and please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. "I was thinking, if you're not in a hurry to get to Winnemucca, maybe you could stay on here for a bit. We don't have much in the way of society, but there are some families in the area who would probably welcome a seamstress. And the schoolteacher in the nearest settlement, about 15 miles south, she's been talking about wanting an assistant. Her school's grown too large for one person to manage." Grace looked between Preston and Margaret, seeing the genuine welcome in both their faces. It was tempting, so tempting to accept, but she was wary of becoming dependent on their kindness, of wearing out her welcome. "I wouldn't want to be a burden," she said carefully. "A burden?" Margaret laughed. "Dear girl, having another woman around would be a blessing. I love my son, but he's not much for conversation, and I do miss having female company. Besides, I could use help with the mending. Between Preston and the ranch hands we hire during busy seasons, I feel like I'm constantly patching clothes." "We'd pay you, of course," Preston added quickly. "Room and board, plus a wage. And if you decide to move on after a while, well, at least you'd have some money saved and time to figure out your next step." It was a generous offer, more generous than Grace had any right to expect. She thought about the alternative. Arriving in Winnemucca with barely any money, no connections, and no guarantee of finding work. At least here she would be safe and valued. "All right," she said softly. "I'll stay at least for a while, and thank you, both of you. I don't know how to repay this kindness." "You can repay it by being happy," Margaret said firmly. "That's all the payment I need." The days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Grace helped Margaret with household chores, mending, and cooking. She discovered that she enjoyed the work, the simple satisfaction of creating order and comfort. Margaret was easy company, full of stories about the early days in Nevada, when she and her late husband had first homesteaded this land. Preston was gone for much of each day, working with the horses or mending fences or any of the 100 other tasks that came with running a ranch. But in the evenings, he would come in for supper, and Grace found herself looking forward to those meals more than she cared to admit. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that often caught her by surprise. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Preston invited her to come see the horses after dinner. Margaret shooed them out with a knowing smile that made Grace blush. The sun was setting as they walked to the corral, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The horses nickered softly as Preston approached, clearly recognizing him. He whistled, and a beautiful bay mare trotted over, nuzzling at his pockets. "This is Copper," Preston said, stroking the mare's nose. "She's my best breeder. Smart as a whip and gentle as a lamb. Go ahead, you can pet her." Grace reached out tentatively, and the mare's nose felt like velvet under her fingers. Copper snorted softly, as though approving of this new human. "She likes you," Preston observed. "Horses are good judges of character." "You really believe that?" Grace asked. "I do. Animals can sense things about people that other humans miss. They know when someone's trustworthy, when someone's kind. Copper here, she won't go near anyone who's cruel or dishonest, but she came right to you." Grace felt absurdly pleased by this. "How did you get into horse breeding?" Preston leaned against the fence, his eyes distant. "My father started it, actually. He believed that the right horse could save your life out here. Speed is good, but endurance and intelligence are better. He taught me to look for horses with heart, with spirit. After he died, I kept it going. It's been slow, but I'm building a reputation. People come from 3 counties over now to buy Lewis horses. Your father would be proud," Grace said softly. "I hope so." Preston turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious. "Can I ask you something, Grace?" "Of course. You ever think about going back?" "To Missouri, I mean. You must have friends there, people who care about you." Grace shook her head. "There's nothing for me back there. My parents are gone, and the friends I had have all married and moved on with their lives. I came west looking for a fresh start, and despite everything that happened with my uncle, I still think it was the right choice." "I'm glad," Preston said, and there was something in his voice that made Grace's pulse quicken. "I'm glad you came west. I'm glad I found you on that road." Their eyes met, and for a moment Grace thought he might say something more. But then a horse whinnied in the distance, breaking the spell, and Preston cleared his throat. "We should head back. It's getting dark, and Mama will worry." As they walked back to the house, Grace found herself acutely aware of Preston beside her, of the way their hands almost brushed, of the warmth that radiated from him in the cooling evening air. Something was growing between them, something she had never felt before, and it both thrilled and terrified her. The weeks passed, and Grace settled into life on the Lewis ranch with surprising ease. Margaret taught her about desert gardening, about which plants could survive the harsh conditions and which were doomed to fail. Grace, in turn, shared her knowledge of fine needlework, teaching Margaret more decorative stitches than the purely practical ones she had relied on for years. Word spread quickly in the scattered community about the seamstress staying at the Lewis ranch, and soon Grace had a steady stream of customers. Ranch wives brought torn dresses to be mended, shirts that needed patching, and curtains that needed hemming. Grace worked quickly and efficiently, and her prices were fair. The money she earned went into a small wooden box under her bed, a growing nest egg that represented security and independence. But it was her time with Preston that she treasured most. He began teaching her to ride, starting with Copper, who was as patient with Grace's inexperience as Preston had promised. At first, Grace was terrified, certain she would fall and break her neck. But Preston was always there, walking alongside her, his voice calm and encouraging. "You're doing great," he would say. "Just relax. Let Copper do the work. She knows what she's doing." Gradually, Grace's confidence grew. She learned to post to the trot, to guide Copper with gentle pressure from her legs, to read the mare's moods and respond accordingly. And as her riding improved, Preston started taking her on longer rides, showing her the land he loved. He took her to a hidden canyon where a spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a small oasis of green in the desert. He showed her ancient petroglyphs carved into stone faces by people who had lived here long before the white settlers arrived. He taught her to read the landscape, to spot the signs of water and shelter that could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving land. During these rides, they talked about everything and nothing. Preston told her about his dreams for the ranch, about the breeding program he was developing, about his hope to eventually buy more land and expand his operation. Grace told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents and the life she had lost, about her dreams of having a home and family of her own someday. "You'll have that," Preston said one afternoon as they sat beside the spring, letting the horses drink. "Any man would be lucky to have you as his wife." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's the truth." Preston picked up a pebble and tossed it into the water, watching the ripples spread. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I think I'm falling in love with you. Actually, that's not quite right. I know I'm falling in love with you. I have been since the moment I saw you on that road, so determined and brave, facing down the desert alone rather than accepting a fate you didn't choose." Grace stared at him, unable to find words. Preston continued, his voice earnest. "I know it's fast. I know you probably think I'm crazy. But I've never felt this way about anyone before. You're smart and strong and kind, and being with you feels like coming home. I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be there. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you." He took her hand, his touch gentle. "But I also know you've been hurt, that you've got reasons to be wary of men and their promises. So I'm not asking for an answer right now. I'm just asking if you might consider it, if you might consider me." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said if they were tears of joy or fear or some combination of both. "Preston, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. That's all I ask." "I care about you," Grace said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "More than I've cared about anyone. But I'm scared. What if I'm not strong enough for this life? What if you change your mind and decide I'm not what you want after all?" Preston reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Grace Sullivan, you walked miles alone through the desert rather than surrender your freedom. You're the strongest person I know. And as for changing my mind, that's not going to happen. When a Lewis loves someone, it's forever. My father loved my mother for 42 years, until the day he died. That's the kind of love I'm offering you. The forever kind." Something in Grace's chest seemed to unlock at his words. She thought about the past weeks, about how safe she had felt here, how valued and respected. She thought about Preston's kindness, his gentleness with the horses, the way he treated his mother with such obvious affection and respect. She thought about how her heart lifted every time she heard his footsteps on the porch, how she found excuses to be near him, how she dreamed about him at night. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I have been from the beginning. When you offered me that ride, you saved more than just my life. You gave me hope." Preston's face broke into a smile so bright it could have outshone the sun. "Is that a yes?" Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes. Yes, Preston Lewis, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll take that forever you're offering." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Grace felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment. All the loss and pain, all the fear and uncertainty had brought her here, to this spring in the desert, to this man who saw her as she truly was and loved her anyway. When they returned to the ranch that evening, Margaret took one look at their faces and started crying happy tears. "About time," she said, pulling them both into a fierce hug. "I've been praying for this since the day you brought her home, Preston. Grace, welcome to the family. Officially, I mean." They were married a month later in the small church in Humboldt, with Margaret and a few close friends as witnesses. Grace wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Margaret had contributed from her own wedding dress. Preston wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous and so full of love that Grace felt her heart might burst. The preacher, a kind old man named Reverend Thompson, spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and faith and the joining of two souls. But Grace barely heard the words. She was too busy looking at Preston, at the way the afternoon light caught in his hair, at the tender expression on his face as he repeated his vows. "I, Preston Lewis, take you, Grace Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. In sickness and in health, in prosperity and hardship, I will stand by your side. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Grace's voice trembled as she spoke her own vows. "I, Grace Sullivan, take you, Preston Lewis, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, support you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. You gave me hope when I had none and safety when I was lost. I will spend the rest of my life showing you what that means to me. This I swear before God and these witnesses." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Preston kissed her with such gentle reverence that Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. Behind them, Margaret sniffled loudly and blew her nose into a handkerchief. The wedding breakfast was held at the ranch, with Margaret's friends from the area bringing food and well wishes. There was music and dancing, and Grace found herself swept up in the celebration, passed from partner to partner as the fiddler played lively tunes. But her eyes always found Preston, and each time their gazes met, she felt that same surge of joy and wonder. As the sun began to set and the guests departed, Margaret hugged them both and announced that she was going to stay with her friend Martha for a few days. "You newlyweds need time alone," she said with a wink that made Grace blush. "I'll be back Wednesday and not a moment sooner." Alone in the house for the first time, Grace felt suddenly shy. Preston seemed to sense this, because he took her hand and led her out to the porch where they could watch the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Nervous?" he asked softly. "A little," Grace admitted. "It's all happening so fast. We can take this as slow as you need," Preston said. "I meant what I said. Forever. We have all the time in the world." Grace turned to him, this man who had become her whole world in such a short time. "I don't want to wait. I want to start our forever right now." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Grace felt desire kindle in her belly. Preston lifted her into his arms as though she weighed nothing and carried her across the threshold of their home, into the life they would build together. The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. She and Preston fell into an easy partnership, working side by side to manage the ranch and build their future. Grace took over more of the household management, freeing Margaret to focus on her beloved garden and her social connections in the community. Preston continued to expand his horse breeding operation, and Grace often helped him, learning to assess bloodlines and temperament. They made the house truly theirs, adding small touches that reflected their joined lives. Grace sewed curtains for the windows and embroidered pillowcases with their intertwined initials. Preston built her a sewing room in the corner of the house with good light and plenty of storage for fabric and thread. They fell into comfortable routines, but also made sure to keep spontaneity alive, taking impromptu rides out to the spring or staying up late to watch meteor showers. By spring, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. His whoop of joy could probably be heard in the next county, and he picked her up and spun her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Grace, we're having a baby." Margaret cried again, of course, and immediately began knitting tiny blankets and planning the nursery. The next months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Grace continued her sewing work as long as she was able, building up their savings against the day when she would need to take time away. The baby came on a cold November night, arriving after 12 hours of labor that left Grace exhausted but exhilarated. Preston stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A fine, healthy boy." They named him Samuel, after Preston's father, and when the midwife placed him in Grace's arms, she understood for the first time what it meant to have your heart exist outside your body. Samuel had Preston's eyes and her nose, and when he wrapped his tiny fist around her finger, she fell completely and irrevocably in love for the second time in her life. Preston was a devoted father from the first moment. He would walk Samuel around the house at night when the baby couldn't sleep, singing old cowboy ballads in his rumbling voice. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving horses into the headboard. He would sit and stare at his son for hours as though he couldn't quite believe this miracle they had created. "Thank you," he told Grace one night as she nursed Samuel. "Thank you for him. Thank you for this life. Thank you for saying yes that day by the spring." "Thank you for riding past me on that road," Grace replied. "Thank you for offering me a ride. Thank you for offering me forever." Life on the ranch continued to flourish. Preston's horse breeding program gained recognition, and they were able to hire 2 permanent ranch hands to help with the increased workload. Grace's sewing business continued to thrive, and she took on a young girl from a neighboring ranch as an apprentice, teaching her the fine needlework skills that had served Grace so well. When Samuel was 2, Grace became pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy seemed easier, though the birth was no less intense. Their daughter arrived on a sunny May morning with red gold hair and a piercing cry that suggested she would not be ignored. They named her Rose, and she was every bit as headstrong as her birth suggested. Where Samuel was quiet and contemplative, Rose was bold and adventurous. By the time she could walk, she was following Preston around the ranch, demanding to help with everything. Preston doted on her shamelessly, letting her ride in front of him on his horse and teaching her the names of all the animals: Margaret, now in her 60s but still energetic, proved to be a wonderful grandmother. She told the children stories about the old days, taught them to recognize edible plants, and spoiled them with sweets when Grace wasn't looking. The house rang with laughter and the sounds of childhood, and Grace often found herself pausing in her work just to appreciate the beautiful chaos of it all. The years passed with the kind of speed that only comes when you're truly happy. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Grace taught him to read using an old primer she had brought from Missouri, and Preston taught him about horses and the land. When he turned 7, they arranged for him to attend the school in the settlement 15 miles south, the same one where Grace had once considered seeking work. Rose was a force of nature, refusing to be left behind when her brother learned new things. By the time she was 5, she could ride a horse competently and knew more about animal husbandry than some grown men. She had her father's way with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish colt with patience and soft words. When Samuel was 10 and Rose was 8, Grace gave birth to twin boys, James and Thomas. The twins were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. James was easy and cheerful, smiling at everyone, while Thomas was more reserved, observing the world with solemn dark eyes before deciding whether to engage. The house had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family. Preston and his ranch hands added 2 more bedrooms upstairs and enlarged the kitchen. Grace's sewing room became a schoolroom during the day, where she taught all 4 children their letters and numbers when they weren't attending the settlement school. It was a full life, sometimes overwhelming in its demands, but Grace wouldn't have changed a moment of it. She thought sometimes about that desperate young woman walking alone on a dusty road, and she could hardly believe she was the same person. That woman had been running from something. Grace now was running toward something every day, toward the life she and Preston were building, toward the future they were creating for their children. One evening, when the children were all finally asleep and Grace and Preston sat together on the porch as they had so many times before, Preston took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You have any regrets?" he asked. "About how things turned out, I mean." "You could have gone to Winnemucca, found work, maybe married someone else, had an easier life maybe in town instead of out here." Grace laughed softly. "An easier life. Maybe, but not a better one. Preston, I have everything I never knew I wanted. I have you, I have our children, I have a home and work that matters. Some people spend their whole lives searching for what we've found. I'm grateful every single day. Even when the twins are screaming and Rose is trying to climb on the barn roof and Samuel is lost in a book instead of doing his chores," Preston teased. "Even then," Grace confirmed. "Especially then, because all of that chaos means we're alive and we're together. Do you have regrets?" Preston pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Not a single one. That day I saw you on the road, something told me to stop. Something told me you were important, best instinct I ever followed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Grace thought about destiny and chance, about the choices that had led her to this moment. If her uncle had been a better man, she never would have run. If Preston had taken a different road that day, they never would have met. So many tiny decisions, so many moments that could have gone differently, and yet they had found each other. "I love you," she said softly. "I'll love you forever." "Forever," Preston agreed, "just like I promised." The children grew as children do. Samuel developed a passion for learning that eventually led him to attend a teaching college in Carson City. He wrote letters home every week, full of enthusiasm for his studies and his plans to return and improve education in rural Nevada. Grace and Preston couldn't have been more proud. Rose, true to her nature, refused to follow conventional paths. She had no interest in traditionally feminine pursuits, though Grace had tried to teach her sewing and cooking. Instead, she worked alongside her father, becoming so skilled with horses that by the time she was 16, she was training them herself. Buyers started asking specifically for horses trained by Rose Lewis, and Preston would beam with pride every time. The twins were still young, only 12, but already showing their distinct personalities. James was social and charming, making friends everywhere he went, while Thomas preferred the company of animals and books. Both were excellent riders, and both showed promise in helping manage the ranch when they were older. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep when Grace was 38, having lived to see her grandchildren nearly grown. They buried her in the small cemetery outside Humboldt, and the entire community turned out to pay their respects. She had been beloved by everyone, known for her kindness and her generous spirit. After the funeral, Grace found a letter Margaret had left for her. Through tears, she read her mother-in-law's elegant script. "My dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I've gone on to join my beloved husband and I am at peace. I want you to know what a blessing you've been to this family. Preston was a good man before he met you, but you made him whole. You gave him love and purpose and beautiful children, and you turned our house into a true home. I was right to trust my instinct that day Preston brought you to us. I knew then that you were special, that you were meant to be part of our family. Thank you for loving my son, for giving me grandchildren to cherish, for being the daughter I never had. Live well, love deeply, and know that I will always be watching over you all, with all my love, Margaret." Grace wept, and Preston held her, both of them mourning the woman who had welcomed Grace so completely and loved them both so well. Life continued, as it always does. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most respected horse breeding operations in northern Nevada. Preston's horses were known throughout the region for their intelligence, endurance, and gentle temperament. They commanded premium prices, and the Lewis family became comfortably well off, though they never lost their humble roots or their work ethic. Samuel graduated from teaching college and returned home as he had promised. He took a position at the settlement school, bringing new teaching methods and a passion for learning that inspired his students. He married a young woman from Winnemucca, a teacher herself, and they settled nearby, giving Grace and Preston their first grandchildren. Rose took longer to settle down, too independent and too busy with the horses to think much about romance. But at 22, she met a young rancher from California who had come to buy horses and stayed for Rose. His name was Daniel, and he was one of the few men who could match Rose's spirit without trying to dim it. Their courtship was a whirlwind of riding competitions and spirited debates, and when they married, it was clear to everyone that they were perfectly matched. The twins remained on the ranch, becoming Preston's partners in running the operation. James handled the business side, negotiating sales and managing finances with charm and efficiency. Thomas worked with the horses, developing the breeding program further and introducing new bloodlines carefully selected for quality. Grace and Preston found themselves with an increasingly quiet house as their children built their own lives. They were grandparents several times over, with Samuel's children and Rose's twins visiting regularly. The ranch hands' children called them Grandma Grace and Grandpa Preston, and Grace spent many happy hours teaching a new generation of young people to sew and read. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Preston took Grace back to the spring where he had first told her he loved her. The years had been kind to him, silvering his hair but not dimming the warmth in his eyes. Grace herself was graying at the temples and had laugh lines etched deep around her eyes, earned through years of joy. 25 years, Preston marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like you've always been here. Both are true, Grace said. We've lived a lifetime together, and yet every day with you feels new. Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a horse. I wanted to give you something to mark the occasion. This seemed fitting given how it all started. You, me, and Copper on that road. Grace fastened the necklace around her neck, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. I love it, and I love you, still, always. Still and always, Preston echoed. That's us. They stayed by the spring until sunset, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and their plans for the future, about everything and nothing. It was like hundreds of conversations they had had before, comfortable and easy, the kind of talk that only comes after years of truly knowing someone. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, Grace thought about that terrified young woman walking alone, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for every twist of fate that had brought her here. She had found her forever, and it was better than anything she could have imagined. The years continued to pass. Preston and Grace grew older together, their hair turning white, their movements slower but no less purposeful. They handed more and more of the ranch operations over to the twins, content to serve as advisors and to spend time with their growing brood of grandchildren. They took up new hobbies that suited their age. Grace taught sewing classes to young girls in the community, passing on skills that might otherwise be lost. Preston mentored young ranchers, sharing decades of hard-won knowledge about horse breeding and land management. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to San Francisco to see the ocean and to Salt Lake City to visit distant relatives. But they always came back to the ranch, to the home they had built together. It was where they belonged, where their roots ran deep into the Nevada soil. When Grace was 61, she fell ill with pneumonia. It was winter, and the cold had settled into her lungs despite everyone's best efforts. Preston barely left her side, holding her hand and telling her stories about their life together. "You remember the day we met?" he asked as she struggled to breathe. "You were so fierce, so determined. I fell in love with you right then, though I didn't know it yet." Grace managed a weak smile. "I thought you were going to rob me." "I did rob you," Preston said, his voice breaking slightly. "I robbed you of a safe, comfortable life in town. I brought you out here to the middle of nowhere to hard work and harsh weather and isolation." Grace squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "You gave me everything. Love, family, purpose, home. Don't you dare apologize for that." With careful nursing from her family and the doctor from Humboldt, Grace slowly recovered. The illness left her weaker than before, but alive. Preston thanked God every day for her recovery, and he became even more attentive, making sure she didn't overexert herself. "You're hovering," Grace told him one afternoon as he fussed over her blanket for the third time. "I almost lost you," Preston said simply. "I'm allowed to hover." "We're going to be fine," Grace assured him. "We have years yet." She was right. They had another decade together. Years filled with more grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together over 100 people, all touched in some way by Preston and Grace's love story. Samuel gave a speech, talking about the example his parents had set, about the power of commitment and faith and simple kindness. "My father offered my mother a ride one day," he said. "And then he offered her forever. That's what real love is. It's seeing someone who needs help and offering everything you have. It's building a life together one day at a time through hardship and joy. Thank you, Mama and Papa, for showing all of us what that looks like." Rose, ever practical, simply raised her glass and said, To Mama and Papa. May we all be lucky enough to find what you found. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren swarmed around them, full of hugs and kisses, and Grace felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the legacy she and Preston had created. It wasn't just the ranch or the horses or the material success they had achieved. It was this: a family bound by love, a community enriched by their presence, a story that would be told for generations. Preston died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Grace beside him as she had been for over 50 years. His last words were, "I love you," spoken with the same sincerity as the first time he had said them by the spring all those years ago. Grace mourned deeply, feeling as though half of herself had been torn away. But she was surrounded by family, by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried Preston's legacy forward. She continued to live at the ranch, now managed by her grandsons, content to sit on the porch and watch the horses, remembering. She lived another 5 years after Preston's death, and in that time she wrote down their story. She wanted future generations to know how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had built something beautiful out of a chance encounter on a dusty road. She wrote about the importance of kindness, of taking chances, of offering help to those who need it. When Grace passed away at 87, she was buried beside Preston in the cemetery outside Humboldt. Their headstone, paid for by their children, bore a simple inscription: Preston and Grace Lewis. He offered a ride. She accepted. Together they found forever. The ranch continued under the management of the twins and their children. The horses still bore the Lewis name, still had that particular intelligence and gentleness that Preston had bred for. The house still stood, expanded over the years but with its original core intact, a testament to the love that had built it. And every year on the anniversary of Preston and Grace's first meeting, the family gathered at the ranch to remember and celebrate. They told the story to the youngest children, about the cowboy who saw a woman walking alone and stopped to help, about the woman brave enough to accept, about the love that grew from that simple act of kindness. It became a legend in the family, this story of Preston and Grace. But it was more than just a tale of romance. It was a reminder that the smallest choices can change everything, that kindness matters, that love is worth the risk, and that forever is possible if you're brave enough to reach for it. The spring where Preston first declared his love became a special place for the family. Couples went there to propose or to renew their vows. Parents took their children there to tell them about their great-great-grandparents. It remained unspoiled and beautiful, a hidden oasis in the desert, just as it had been when Preston first brought Grace there. Samuel's grandson, named Preston after his great-grandfather, became a writer and eventually published the story that Grace had written. It became a beloved tale throughout Nevada and beyond, inspiring countless readers with its message of hope and love. People wrote letters to the family, sharing their own stories of chance meetings and unexpected love, of how Grace and Preston's story had given them courage to take their own chances. The ranch itself became something of a landmark, known not just for its horses but for its history. Visitors would sometimes stop by, hoping to hear stories about the famous Preston and Grace Lewis. The family was always gracious, always willing to share, understanding that their ancestors' love story had become bigger than just family history. It had become a symbol of what was possible in a harsh land, a reminder that beauty and love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Decades after both Preston and Grace had passed, a filmmaker came to Nevada to make a documentary about the Old West. He heard the story of Preston and Grace and became fascinated. With the family's permission, he told their story as part of his film, using Grace's written account and interviews with descendants who had heard stories firsthand from Preston and Grace themselves. The documentary brought even more attention to their story. Historians noted how their marriage reflected the realities of frontier life, how women like Grace often came west seeking opportunity and freedom, how men like Preston built legacies through hard work and integrity. Their story was taught in schools as an example of pioneer resilience and the building of the American West. But for the family, it was never about fame or recognition. It was about remembering where they came from, about honoring the love that had created them all. Every Lewis descendant grew up knowing the story, knowing that they existed because a cowboy had stopped to help a stranger, because a woman had been brave enough to trust. The values that Preston and Grace had lived by, kindness, hard work, integrity, commitment, continued to shape the family for generations. They ran their businesses honestly, treated their employees well, and were always ready to help neighbors in need. They married for love, not convenience, and they worked through their problems rather than giving up when things got hard. And always, they remembered that first ride, when Preston offered Grace not just transportation but hope, not just safety but the possibility of something more. They remembered Grace's courage in accepting, in taking a chance on a stranger, in being willing to believe in kindness after she had been treated so cruelly. The leather industry evolved, and the West changed beyond recognition from what Preston and Grace had known. Humboldt grew from a rough frontier town into a proper city. The desert was crossed now by highways instead of wagon trails. Horses were no longer the primary means of transportation, though the Lewis Ranch still bred them, now primarily for show and pleasure riding rather than practical necessity. But through all the changes, the story endured. It was told and retold, each generation adding its own perspective while keeping the essential truth intact. That love can come from the most unexpected places, that one moment of kindness can change everything, that forever is not just a promise but a choice you make every single day. The ranch house itself, now over a century and a half old, was eventually added to the National Register of Historic Places. It was lovingly maintained by the family, with original features preserved and stories of its history told to anyone who visited. The room where Grace had first stayed, the sewing room Preston had built for her, the nursery where their children had slept all were kept much as they had been, museums to a love that had transcended time. On summer evenings, when the desert air finally cooled and the stars came out in their thousands, you could still find Lewis descendants sitting on that same porch where Preston and Grace had sat so many times. They would hold hands and watch the horizon and think about their ancestors, about the incredible journey that had started with a simple offer of a ride. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, it almost seemed like you could hear echoes of laughter from long ago, the sound of children playing and horses neighing, and a man and woman who had loved each other so well that their love had created a legacy that would never die. The story of Preston and Grace Lewis became more than just a family legend. It became a touchstone, a reminder that in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, love and kindness could still triumph. That a chance meeting on a dusty road could become a lifetime of joy. That forever was not just possible but within reach for anyone brave enough to offer it, and to accept it when it was offered in return.